I feel like the guys in Spinal Tap, you know, and then when they try to go get on stage and they end up wandering around the bowels of some stadium somewhere in the American Midwest. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Steve. Return engagements are always especially gratifying because they suggest that you didn't screw things up too badly the first time around. Um, Two North Korean acquaintances met on the street, Mr. Park and Mr. Kim. Mr. Park said to Mr. Kim, "Comrade Kim, good to see you. Hey, how about that new oil refinery up in Hamhung?" Mr. Park said, "New oil refinery? I was just in Hamhung last week. I didn't see any new oil refinery." Mr. Kim said, "Well, how about the new textile mill in Chongjin?" He said, "Mr. Kim, I was in Chongjin yesterday. There's no new textile mill." I said, "Comrade Park, you should stop getting around so much and start reading the newspaper." The presentation today is going to be a sort of getting around presentation versus what you read in the newspaper. As I was chatting with Ambassador Minton earlier today, there's an obvious and understandable focus on what my colleague Steph Haggard always refers to as the high politics of diplomacy, of whether we're going to re-engage in the six-party talks, and if so, under what conditions, and if we do exactly what we're going to accomplish, and so on. But there's another aspect of reality, and I don't want to call it low politics. I think it deserves something greater than that, which is about people's everyday lives and the internal dynamics of a society. And so what I'm going to focus on today is a discussion of the ongoing dynamic changes that are occurring in North Korea that we see only vaguely and obscured, and through the window, to a large extent, of the testimonies of refugees. The work is based on two surveys. The first survey was a survey of approximately 1,300, a little bit more than that, refugees done in China, basically in calendar year 2005. This survey was done surreptitiously. The people we were interviewing were, in effect, illegal aliens subject to forcible deportation to North Korea, where they could face very severe punishments. And so, for understandable reasons, I think, the standards of that survey did not reach kind of normal social science standards as practiced in other environments. In part because of those concerns, we were able to receive a grant and do a second survey in November 2008. This was conducted in South Korea. And in the more secure legal environment, we were able to administer a much longer and more nuanced survey questionnaire. And we were quite relieved to find that the results that we received from this second sort of higher quality survey almost entirely coincided with the results we had obtained earlier when we did our work in China. So today what I'm going to do is present work. It's going to be largely from that second survey done in South Korea, but some of it may be from the China survey. I'll let you know as we go along. Now, there are basically two reasons why we're interested in North Korean refugees. The first is we're interested in them in and of themselves. The refugee problem in North Korea is a first-order humanitarian problem. These people exit largely from North Korea to China because of the government of China's unwillingness to allow the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to do asylum assessments in China. These people are forced to do a second on-migration to a third country where they can make their asylum claims, either Mongolia or countries in Southeast Asia such as Vietnam or Thailand. So it is truly an arduous journey that these people, some of which are families with children, are forced to undergo. And due to their lack of legal status in China, they are subject to all kinds of depredations in China. And it is indeed a very difficult and tough life. And so our first reason for concern about the refugees is because of the refugees themselves. But secondly, as I've already indicated, the refugees provide a kind of window into North Korea. And in this kind of information-constrained environment, they can bring a lot to bear in terms of our understanding of North Korean society and the changes in which it's going through. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is sort of walk through the book. First, spend a little time on that first topic, the refugee experience itself, and then look at what the refugees tell us about North Korea. And I'm going to look at basically three topics. First, what they tell us about the changing economy of North Korea. Secondly, what they tell us about the use of the penal system in North Korea. And finally, what kind of political implications these developments may have for North Korea. And then finally, at the end, being from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, I have to be prescriptive, so there's some stuff on policy recommendations. So that's the basic outline. So let's start with the beginning, the refugees themselves. As I indicated, we did two surveys, one in China and one in South Korea. What we find is that the refugees, by and large, indicate that, the reasons they left North Korea are for economic reasons. Yes, there we go. But the share that cite political motives is rising, and in the more recent survey was more than a quarter of the people we interviewed. We find that probably half or more of the people we interviewed in China in a clinical setting would be diagnosed as suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. And indeed, in South Korea, there is a growing medical literature and a growing medical practice involving dealing with these psychological afflictions of the refugee or defector population once they're in South Korea. We find that the psychological distress is linked both to their experiences in North Korea, in particular the continuing reverberations of the famine experience on this population, as well as their experiences in China, which, as I indicated, can be quite harsh. Among the refugees we interviewed in China, very few, or relatively few, have an interest in remaining in China, at least under current rules. If their status was regularized, then a substantial number of these people might be willing to essentially stay in China, living in the border area, living within the Korean-Chinese community there, if their status was regularized. But under the current rules, which they're subject to forcible repatriation to North Korea, not very many want to stay in China. Most of them want to go to South Korea, but interestingly enough, the younger, more educated ones express a preference for coming to the United States. I find it really extraordinary. Despite the fact that they've been subjected to lifelong, virulently anti-American propaganda, the young, educated North Korean refugees want to come to Disneyland. And I think I'll leave it at that and move on in the interest of time. So what about the economy? Well, one of the things we know is that the North Korean economy has basically marketized over the last 15 to 20 years. That marketization was not any kind of intentionally planned top-down reform, but was rather a product of state failure. And the state has never been comfortable with that process. And so much of the book is devoted to sort of household economics and understanding how people operate in this new kind of semi-reformed, highly corrupt market economy that North Korea has become. And just to give you some indications of some of the interesting things that come out of that, is we ask people, what is the best way to make money in North Korea? And as you can see, the best way to make money in North Korea is go for the green. It is to engage in market activity. But the growth in each of these panels is people who left at a different time. So it's looking at sort of change over time. The growth sector is the one in red, and that is engage in corrupt or criminal activities. We asked them another question, which was, what was the best way to get ahead? And as you can see, these blue panels, the blue panels remain the dominant way of getting ahead, and that's the state or the party. So the state remains the dominant sort of institution in society. The kind of growth industry, or the one of increasing preference, is going into business. Interestingly enough, joining the army, the red one almost disappears, despite military first politics. For the average North Korean conscript, it is increasingly well understood that joining the army is not the way to get ahead. And these two panels are linked, as I will discuss in a moment. Increasingly in North Korea, involvement with the state or the party is not undertaken out of patriotism or of some sense of fidelity, but rather the state and the party are platforms for corruption. They're platforms for economic predation and enriching yourself on the backs of your neighbors. And so, and I will elaborate on that in a moment. Whenever you do research, you go into the project with a set of prior beliefs or expectations. But one almost always, if you're doing good research, find things that you did not anticipate. One of the things that Steph and I didn't fully anticipate when we began this research was to the extent that the penal system in North Korea increasingly functions not only in its traditional role as a mechanism of criminal control or political repression, but increasingly as a mechanism for economic extortion. We found, for example, that among the respondents in our samples, those who were engaged in market activities had a 50% higher rate of being arrested. And once they're arrested, they are subject to punishment without any kind of due process in most cases. We asked them, for example, before you were incarcerated, did you have any formal legal procedure or trial? And only 12% said yes. The vast majority said no, there was no formal legal proceedings. I was just put in incarceration. Once in incarceration, they're subjected to severe punishment. North Korea has a highly articulated penal system, ranging from what are called labor retraining centers, kind of at the bottom, through institutions that be roughly equivalent to jails and felony prisons, up to the political gulag. We expected to observe the rates of abuse in these institutions to escalate as you went from the sort of relatively mild sort of institutions to the hardest core political prisons. And indeed, we do observe that escalation of abuse. But the escalation is far milder. The slope is far flatter than we expected. Even people in those lowest level institutions that are by and large, or where many of these so-called economic criminals are incarcerated, are subject to fantastic rates of abuse. So you basically have a system in which, roughly speaking, because of this incredibly broad definitions of economic crimes, any average non-elite North Korean going about their day-to-day life is probably in violation of one stricture or another. The police are given extraordinary discretion about who they arrest, how long they detain them, and the conditions under which those individuals are detained. Given that set of facts, this is an almost perfect mechanism for extracting bribes. Because if you know that the police can take not only you, but your family, and incarcerate them in these facilities where terrible abuses are practiced, you will be willing to pay to keep yourself from being entangled in such a system. So we find, for example, that even prisoners in these lowest level facilities, for the median length of their, I don't want to call it a sentence because it's not a sentence, the median length of incarceration, they have a 60% likelihood, they reported a 60% likelihood of observing an execution, more than 80% likelihood of observing forced starvation, and so on. So these conditions are really quite horrific. Now, as I mentioned, it is what they are reporting. These are self-reported accounts, and we have no way of checking the accuracy of those accounts. But we have little ways, little tricks within our survey to informally check, to see if the patterns of responses appear to be running off the rails or not. So for example, in the section where we ask the people who report that they have been incarcerated about their experiences in incarceration, we start off asking them a hierarchy of questions. We ask them, for example, have you ever seen a prisoner beaten? Well, the affirmative response rate on that is about 100%. I suspect that if you went to the DC City Jail or Rikers Island and you started asking the inmates, have you ever seen a prisoner beaten, the affirmative response rate would probably be roughly 100%. I expect that in most prisons around the world, if you ask prisoners, have you ever seen anybody beaten, they'll say yes. But then we started getting more specific. Have you ever seen anybody beaten to death? Have you ever seen a public execution? And so on, all the way down to the alleged crime of forced abortion and infanticide. And what's very interesting is the patterns of responses drop appropriately as you go from relatively, what you would expect to be relatively common ubiquitous abuses to the highly specific abuse of infanticide and forced abortion. And the pattern of responses line up across the two surveys, which leads us to believe that whether those numbers are absolutely accurate or not, there is serious information contained in them, that the people are not just telling us what they think we want to hear. There's also a gender dimension to all of this, and Steph and I are actually in the process of writing a paper devoted to gender issues. One of the ways that North Korea developed in the 1990s is that, in part due to lack of any coherent women's movement or feminist thought in North Korea, women were disproportionately shed from state employment. State employment was supposed to be sort of more politically advanced man's work. And so women were disproportionately shed from employment in state-owned enterprises, party offices, government offices, and so on. And they were essentially thrust into this somewhat Hobbesian market economy that was developing in the 1990s. Among the most recent cohort of refugee arrivals that we interviewed, 95% of the women who were engaged in market activities report that they paid bribes in order to do their work. And among the men, 37%, more than a third of the men, said that the best way to get ahead is crime and corruption. And indeed, when we looked at the responses by people who worked in government offices, they report that in fact their colleagues have become more corrupt. And they also report that they are subjected to spend more and more time on ideological indoctrination. The center seems to understand that it's losing control of its agents at the ground level. The upshot of all this is, because the women basically being pushed out of state employment into the market, the state is increasingly male-dominated, and in fact you have an increasingly male-dominated state preying on an increasingly female-dominated or identified market. So there's a gender dimension to all of this as well. So what are the political implications of all this? One of the things we found is that our respondents indicate increasing access to foreign media and foreign news sources specifically. And I call this upper chart the Bill Clinton chart. And I should say I used to work for Bill Clinton, so this is not, I'm not making some kind of partisan point here or whatever. It's just when I saw the chart, I immediately thought of my former boss. What you see in this upper chart is the red part are the people who say, I didn't have any access to foreign media. The blue part are the people who say, yes, I had access to foreign media and I consumed it. And the green part are the people who say, well, I had access to foreign media, but I didn't consume. I forget exactly how Bill Clinton put it, but it was something like, I smoked, but I didn't inhale. There was some sort of, highly... So I always think of the green people as the Bill Clintons, right? I had access, but I didn't actually consume. Well, one of the interesting things about this chart, there are two interesting things. One, as you can see, the blue part is getting bigger steadily. More people are consuming foreign news media. But the green part disappears. The inhibition on consuming foreign media has disappeared. And that is important because access to foreign media is associated with more dissenting views. And increasingly, the meta-narrative of the regime, which is that all our troubles are due to the hostile foreign forces is increasingly disbelieved by the population, at least according to these surveys. Increasingly, the population holds their government responsible for local conditions. These surveys were done before the November 2009 currency reform that Steve mentioned in the introduction. I think that after that experience, there are probably very few North Koreans who believe that their problems are primarily due to foreigners. Nevertheless, it is an atomized population. It is a society characterized by very low levels of trust, as you can understand, why. We asked our respondents a series of questions that could be thought of as kind of political anthropology. We asked them, when you were in North Korea, among your friends, did you joke about the government? No, excuse me, did you joke about conditions? Did you complain about conditions? Did you joke about the government? Did you complain about the government? Did you joke about Kim Jong-il? Did you complain about Kim Jong-il? Do you know people who are organizing against the government? And this is one of these glass half empty, half full type things. Haggard thinks it's half full. I think it's half empty. Remember, we're interviewing refugees. These people have voted with their feet. Almost by definition, they have negative views of conditions and the regime. Otherwise, they wouldn't have left the country. Even among this population, the share that report that among their peers, they joked about conditions or joked about the government never rises above 40%. So you have a situation in which there is, I would argue, there is increasing dissatisfaction, but it is not clear that there are mechanisms for expressing that satisfaction. Which leads me to sort of the last thing I'll talk about in this section, in which is something, again, that we hadn't fully appreciated when we began this research, is something that I ended up calling the market syndrome. We find that people who are engaged in market activities are more likely to identify political reasons as their motive for departure. They're 50% more likely to have been arrested. They have even more negative views of the regime than the average refugee. And here's the critical part. They are more likely to communicate those views to their peers. So in essence, the market is emerging not only as an institution to address the material deprivation of the North Korean people, but it is increasingly a kind of semi-autonomous zone of social communication and potentially political organizing. And on its own terms, the state is right to fear the market. Now, as I mentioned, we're interviewing refugees. And these, as I said, are people who have voted with their feet. And the immediate question that arises is, to what extent are their experiences representative or their views representative of the remaining resident population of North Korea? On one level, that is a question that is impossible for us to answer, because there may simply be characteristics of these individuals that we can't observe that lead them to have very peculiar or distinct views and ideas. But there is quite a bit of information that we have on these individuals. A lot of demographic information. We know their gender, their age, what province they're from. We know what their occupation was. We know what their political classification was. We know, what their father's political classification was. We know what their father's occupation was. We know their age. We know a lot of basic demographic information. We also know something about their life experiences. Did they receive food aid? Had they been incarcerated? And so on. So what we do in the book is we take all that information that we do have on these individuals, and we build multivariate statistical models to try to understand, do they have characteristics that would lead them to have unusual opinions or experiences that would not be representative. And then through those models, we actually make counterfactual projections onto the remaining resident population. What we find is that for questions where we're asking them what you might consider factual questions, how much of your household income came from market activities? How much of your household income came from employment in the formal economy? The projected differences between the sample that we have and the national population appear to be very slight. For all intents and purposes, they really do on the factual questions seem to be pretty representative. On the opinion sorts of questions, there's a little bit more difference. So for example, if we ask them some questions that might be considered approval ratings type questions about the political regime, and here's the sample, and here's our projection of the national average, and as you can see, it's a little higher. But when we calculate what statisticians call the 95% confidence interval, are you 95% sure that those two numbers are the same, or can you say with a 95 degree of confidence that they're different? We can never reject the hypothesis that those are the same numbers. So in the end, we cannot prove that the responses we get from our respondents are perfectly representative of the remaining resident population. But we think that given all the analysis that we do in the counterfactuals, that there is some kind of basic information that is valid, that is contained in these responses, and deserves to be taken seriously. So, what do we do? The refugees, of course, are simply the tip of the iceberg of a much larger human rights and humanitarian problem in North Korea. And so in our analysis of policy, we divide it up into policies directed at the refugees and policies directed at the remaining resident population. And then we further divide the policies into what we call direct policies and indirect policies. Direct policies are things in which you negotiate with the North Korean government. So we would want to negotiate about, family unification, or we might want to negotiate over the terms of humanitarian relief. But then there are also indirect policies. We can provide information to the population of North Korea, whether the government of North Korea acquiesces or not. And we understand that the pursuit of some of these things that we call indirect policies may affect your ability to pursue what we've called direct policies. I mean, the North Korean government may not be happy about some of these things, but we think under the circumstances, it's worth pursuing this agenda, given, frankly, what we see as the relatively meager progress through sort of the official diplomatic channels. And then we also, I keep on getting it backwards. Now it will not. I'm stuck. And now we're going to go behind the screen where the Wizard of Oz is. Ah, there we are. Magic. Magic, it's magic. Yeah. We, in the end, come up with something we call eyes open engagement. Mark Minton earlier, his phrase was engagement without illusions, but I think it's basically the same idea, which is that we want to engage with North Korea. We want to encourage constructive transformation, or transformation in a constructive direction, to make to encourage a society that is more humane internally and less bellicose in its external relations. But we have our eyes open about the nature of this regime and the history here. And so what we really want to focus on is, in the end, is information and the market. We want to try to encourage the development of the market in North Korea because we see it as a way of both addressing the material needs of the North Korean people, but also as a mechanism for reducing the pervasive power of the state, creating alternative pathways to status and wealth, and if not political power, at least start to create the conditions that impose greater constraints on the ability of the North Korean government to act in certain ways. The real tragedy of North Korea is the lack of accountability of this regime. It has an almost unimpeded capacity to impose misery on its own people. And what we are essentially trying to do is lay out an agenda in which gradually over time, one begins to constrain that regime's ability to do that, to try to bring greater accountability into the system. And ultimately, one would want to see a fairly dramatic transformation or change in the political regime. But we recognize that that may be far away. So what are the basic conclusions? Well, obviously North Korea faces a looming succession issue. We think there is probably widespread discontent, but there seems to be a complete absence, at least as far as we can see, of civil society institutions capable of channeling that discontent into constructive political action. We hope those institutions and groups are there, but Haggard and I at least can't see them. There's no Catholic Church or Solidarity Trade Union like there was in Poland. There's no civic forum like there was in Czechoslovakia. There's not even the role that the Catholic Church and Cardinal Sin played in the Philippines, as acting as an alternative moral pole and legitimating dissent. We don't see any of those things in North Korea. One can imagine how they may be there under the surface in various sorts of ways, but we can't see them. So we think it's a situation where there's probably widespread discontent, but little capacity for acting on that discontent. As a consequence, what we see people doing is what the sociologist James C. Scott called in a different context, exiting the system, everyday forms of resistance. Basically, going into the market, listening to foreign news, acting in ways essentially trying to disengage oneself from the state, which is quite difficult given the intimate nature of state control through the criminalization of economic activity in the penal system. As I said, we see the market as a zone of autonomy and freedom. We want to strengthen that, and ultimately, to use a Marxist phrase, we want to intensify the contradictions. We want to try to encourage transformation that will make the regime more accountable and constrain its abilities to impose misery in the way that it does today. That's my presentation. I would be happy to try to answer any questions or engage in dialogue in our remaining time. I want to give a plug to our blog. We have Steph and I run a blog, Witness to Transformation, and North Korea Witness to Transformation. We have postings daily. I'm not sure what's up today. Something Steph wrote. I know I didn't write it. We've given plugs to Korea Society events, and if this is on the Korean Society website, we'll put a link in our blog. So again, it's been a great pleasure to be invited back, and I look forward to our further discussion. Thank you.
If you have a question, we please ask that you make a queue at the mic in the center. Please say your name and your affiliation since we're recording. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marek Stempy. I am a member of Korea Society. I was born and raised in a communist country of Poland, and listening to the result of your survey, it could as well have been done in any of the communist country of Eastern Europe. Probably of all the Eastern European countries, East Germany would be a good case example, comparable. Although economically they were the richest country, but politically the most suppressed. One of my remarks, though, is that I don't know if you took this into consideration, but it requires a special mindset to leave the country. Even in a desperate situation like in Korea, it requires a certain amount of courage and information, certain level maybe even of education. So what you're getting in your surveys, it's a little skewed. But nevertheless, I see valid points.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. There may be things, as you say, a certain mindset that we simply can't capture in our statistical analyses.
I think that possibly you're getting a larger percentage of people who are engaging in the market activities are more likely to think differently and are more likely to leave.
Right, and we subject this data to a lot of scrutiny, and let me just tick off a few things that might be of interest. First of all, what is extraordinary, especially in the China survey, is how little information people had when they left the country. Most of this is word of mouth. And one of the, and it changes over time, because we interviewed people who had left in, as far back as the early 1990s all the way up through 2008. And so there's some changes over time. But at least in the initial waves, especially around the famine period in the mid to late 90s, people were leaving out of desperation with very little information about what they were going to find in China. And it was almost all word of mouth. And some of it was really quite crude. It was like, when you get across the river, look for a building that has this big thing like that. They'll help you. Right, so they were, these people would just show up in churches. They didn't know what a church was, but they had been told that the people at the building with that will help you. One of the things we found, and as I mentioned, to get to South Korea, you have to do a second on-migration, either to Mongolia or to Southeast Asia, typically. One of the things we found very interesting about interviewing people in South Korea is many of them initially just were planning to go to China. And they got to China, and compared to North Korea, China is, information paradise. And once they got to China, they started hearing about South Korea and heard that it was even better than China. And, it's like, hey, why not? And so a number of these people had not originally planned to come to South Korea. They had just planned to go to China, but then they heard about South Korea. They got jobs, they accumulated some funds, and then they did the second on-migration. So, and then finally, the types of people that are coming is changing as well. Initially, in the very old days, it was elite defections. People with fighter aircraft, flying their airplanes to South Korea. Then during the famine period, it was basically workers and farmers. And one of the things that our survey belies are some of North Korea's claims about educational attainment. Remember, these are self-reported. There's no way we can check. So when the guy tells us he has a high school education, we can't check that. And education is something where you presumably, the incentive or the bias is to exaggerate your credentials. What was stunning to us was how little education these people were reporting. And it's just not consistent with North Korean law, right? North Korean law says, you have public education that runs from this thing. We can take the individual's age, we know how old they are, and we know what year they were born. They were not getting the amount of education they were supposed to be getting, on at least the North Korean system claimed they were getting. More recent years, we see more women, and we see more highly educated people. So the demographics of this are changing. Finally, one last thing. We looked a lot on all these questions we were examining. We were trying to see if people from different provinces or cities had different experiences. In general, not. There was one thing that did come out, however, which is that a lot of the refugees come from the far northeast. A lot come from North and South Hamgyong. The people from North Hamgyong seem a little different in certain respects. And the way I would put it is this. It's not easy to get out of North Korea, but it's relatively easy to get out of North Korea if you're starting in North Hamgyong already, okay? So when you looked at kind of the entrepreneurial nature and some of these other questions we asked, the people who came from the provinces further south I mean, these people were really entrepreneurial because they had managed to get themselves all the way through North Korea and then into China and then in some cases into South Korea. Whereas the people in North Hamgyong, some of them, it was in some, again, I don't want to exaggerate this, but it was a little easier for them to get out of the country. And in some ways, they showed less of this entrepreneurial drive than people from some of the other provinces. Yes.
Hi, my name is Emily. I live in New York City. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm also actually interested in interning here for a policy internship. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean by commercial engagement. And I'm sure you get asked this a lot, particularly in light of 2010, the recent events with the ship sinking and Young-kwan. And you mentioned accountability in North Korea, and with respect to the, what could be the nuclear program and concerns and them not letting the IAEA in for inspections, how do you fit that in with obviously the concerns for humanitarian aid?
Sure. Yeah, that was probably, I probably didn't handle that part of the talk very well. And then we also have the issue of PowerPoint, reducing everything to sort of, less than one sentence. Under the current circumstances, it's very hard to move forward with North Korea. I mean, straight up. I mean, if North Korea is, shelling South Korean islands, it's very hard to say, yes, we should, open up new economic engagement. So that argument is premised on there being some reasonable diplomatic environment for those things to go forward. Once they go forward, there are a variety of ways that one can engage. We would argue that humanitarian initiatives really ought to be separated from development or commercial initiatives. So even if the North Korean government is behaving badly, as it has over the last year, if there is, for example, a serious problem with food, we would support providing aid. Because we don't see the ethical argument for punishing essentially families in Chongjin or elementary school children in Wonsan because of the behavior of the government over which they have no. Oh, of course you want to. I mean, Steph and I literally wrote the book on the North Korean famine. We've probably written more about monitoring and the problems of monitoring than anybody else. We know this very well. And there are tricks and things you can do to try to increase the effectiveness of aid, even if the government is uncooperative, as it largely is in the case of North Korea. So we have no illusions about this. But on the humanitarian front, we think that you can move forward with that and separate that. And there's a tradition in that going back all the way to at least Ronald Reagan in American policy of doing that. Developmental and commercial engagement is different. There is a much stronger case for those to be made conditional on other diplomatic and indeed economic policy concerns. What we would like to do, and this is really hard, is to encourage the development, and you would like to call it the non-state sector, but in North Korea there's nothing that's really non-state. It's all gray. But we want to encourage the development of economic institutions and entities that are under less direct state control than others, and that operate on a more sustainable commercial basis than others. That's difficult for an organization like the World Bank, for example, which lends to government. They have an arm called the IFC, which lends to private business. Kind of hard to identify private business in North Korea, but to the extent, but the bumper sticker, if I had the PowerPoint up, the PowerPoint would say, less World Bank, more IFC. Right? That's the kind of tenor or philosophy of what we'd be arguing. Another thing is we see roles for all kinds of lending and investment. Again, you want to try to do that in ways that strengthen entities that are under less direct central control than others. And that's very hard. We're in New York, financial capital of the United States, if not the world. The financial firms here are going to be more comfortable lending money to the North Korean government than lending money to some entity in North Korea that has no credit history and, a pretty dubious set of records and financials, right? So we're going to, as a matter of policy, if you want to get involved in that way and your goal is to try to strengthen those entities, there's actually going to be affirmative policies you'll have to do. Otherwise, the financial institutions will simply lend to the government because that's a safer bet. So that's the sort of thing that we develop in that chapter of the book. But I take your point, and again, it was my mistake not to make that clear in the presentation, that sort of engagement is conditional on some kind of reasonable or plausible diplomatic environment. It's hard to go forward with that if the North Koreans are sinking South Korean ships. Yes.
I'm Yeonjin Yoon from Korean Consulate General's Office. First of all, thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentation. And my question is that you mentioned young educated people leaving North Korea. Does that mean that there's some sort of children of kind of vested interest started to leave North Korea, or just some kind of just a trend? My second question is that you mentioned post-reform or retrenchment in your presentation, but you didn't mention about the year around which year means which year, right. And I want clarification.
Right.
The other point is that you mentioned male-dominating state. It sounds like a kind of the military-first state, and is there any possibility of transforming this type of state into common state? And the other one is that you mentioned that growing number of people are starting to access foreign media. Does that mean the foreign media means Korean media or Chinese media or Japanese media or any United States media? And the other one is that my point is the population trend. Like my country is on the decreasing side of total population, and the other problem is that the increasing trend of the composition of senior citizens in my country. The same thing happens in North Korea or the other way around. And last question is, you mentioned the growing number of people living, I'm sorry, too many questions. Growing number of people living
You're up to 6.
Hamgyong province, but you didn't mention Pyongan province. That means regionalism between the two regions, because traditionally, historically, two regions have regionalism quite a long time ago, but still the same thing happens, or?
Okay. On education, yes, there are some children of the elite leaving because their parents say to get out. But in general, what we were finding was more just there was a trend, and we found this, as I said, this very intriguing result that younger, more educated people tended to express a preference for wanting to come to the United States. Presumably, the family ties with South Korea are more attenuated among young people, and presumably younger, more educated people are more confident about their ability to function in a non-Korean language environment. Whereas older people, less educated people, maybe greater family ties, they want to go to South Korea. The real important issue there, though, is that at least under current rules, relatively few want to remain in China. If China were to change its policies and adopt, permanent, basically have green cards or something, then that might change. And one of the aspects of this, and I know that this might be of interest in terms of the Korea Society's future program, one of the things that's going on now with these women going into China, you have effectively what are non-sanctioned marriages, producing children who, regardless of the constitutional niceties of China and North Korea, are effectively stateless. And the number of those children produced by those unions is probably now in the thousands. And it's a real problem, maybe not a really large scale problem, but it's a real problem. I mean, people who essentially can't go to school and so on. Okay, periodization and retrenchment. Yes, again, I'm sorry, that was my fault. I should have explained it more clearly. What we did was to look at some of these changes over time, we divided up our sample by when people left North Korea. And so we were calling the period the famine period from 1998 and earlier. Then there was a period that was after the famine. Then there was a period from whatever, 98 to 2002. Then there was a sort of reform period, as you remember, 2002. So then from 2003 to 2004, 2005. Then there was a reversal of reforms, basically 2004, 2005. And there's a whole series of things that go on. And clearly the state has engaged in a kind of retrenchment since 2005. The general economic trends in North Korea now are negative. And the November 2009 currency reform is just the exclamation point on that. More has gone on within the last year. So that's what we mean by retrenchment. How do you transform a male-dominated state? That's almost an entire another panel or program. Maybe you can invite me back for that one. I don't know how you do the political transformation of North Korea, but that's something that I think South Korea and the United States ought to be cooperating on very hard. Population. Population is an enormous question. We really don't know much about the population of North Korea. North Korea has produced some censuses, but the veracity of those censuses is subject to great dispute. And in fact, I'm going to write a blog posting within the next week or so where I'm going to critique a recent paper produced by the US Department of Census on the North Korean population census, which I think is rather uncritical and accepting of the North Korean numbers. If you basically take the North Korean numbers on face value, North Korean fertility has dropped quite dramatically. So North Korea has the same kind of population bulge issue that South Korea has, though it's not as far along. The North Korea bulge is kind of coming, whereas the South Koreans have already hit the bulge and are on the other side of it. And finally, regionalism. Yes, of course, there's a history of regionalism in Korean politics. We didn't get any of that out of our survey. Whether that is latent within the Korean Workers' Party and could reemerge in some future environment, either in North Korea or in a unified Korea, that could well be the case, but there's nothing that really addresses that issue in this work. Yes?
I didn't think I'd have a chance to work this in. I'm Homer Williams. I'm a member of the Korea Society. I was wondering if you could come back to the population issue, and I assume you're familiar with the 2008 census, yeah, and deal with any age structure problems you see there, because just in my kind of pedestrian view, it doesn't appear that any famine ever occurred.
Okay, so this is what I'm going to write about probably next week, and I have to, and I want to say that I'm kind of doing this off the top of my head, that I'm going to go back and re-examine the sort of notes I made a few months ago on this issue and try to get it down. So if you look at if you take the 2008 census at face value, and there are reasons to wonder about the veracity of that data. But if you take it at face value, it suggests, or it could be interpreted as indicating that there was a famine, that deaths were on the order of 250,000, which is the North Korean government's sort of semi-official line on that. And so that's what it would imply in terms of that question. But as I said, there are reasons to question the veracity of that data, and something, as I said, I'm planning to write. Maybe I'll write it this weekend. I'm going to go through this in this kind of critique in much greater detail to see if these numbers really seem to make sense or not. Nick Eberstadt at the American Enterprise Institute has done some work that suggests that the censuses in the age and gender structure that comes out of the 2008 census is inconsistent with earlier data that was released, that men and women from certain age cohorts kind of seem to appear and disappear and so on and so forth. But if you take it at face value, it seems to imply a famine of 250,000 people. Famine deaths of 250,000, roughly speaking.
Hi, Hannah Song from Link. Could you talk a little bit more about your opinion on ways that you believe that these markets could be strengthened, and also if remittances were part of the initial survey that you had done with the refugees, or how remittances may or may not play a role as well in terms of helping to strengthen these markets?
Those are good questions. The basic problem that we face is that the North Korean government is not comfortable with the market. And the argument that I've made in this presentation is, from their standpoint, there's reasons why they're not, they have good reason not to be comfortable with the market. And so the state, when it has the capacity, tends to try to repress the market. And that has been going on, that's been the general trend since 2005. And there's various twists and turns in that, but that's a general trend, has been trying to, try to tamp down the market. So when you try to either strengthen the markets as a kind of generic institution, or you try to strengthen the entities that are not state-controlled and operate on a market-conforming, sustainable commercial basis, you're basically going against the policy preferences of the North Korean government. And so that's difficult. And so you have to come up with strategies of how you can do this, recognizing that's not what they want to do. They want to control, they want to centralize. I mean, even in the last year, for example, their relationship with China is quite interesting. They basically, I would characterize the North Korean government's view as, we want to be prosperous, we want to be modern, we want to be prosperous on our terms. So we want to have economic integration with China, but we want to control it. So we can have trade, we can have investment, we can even have labor flows and training, but it's got to be done through institutions that are tightly controlled by central government. We cannot have this decentralized traders, SOEs out there doing deals across their border in China and so on. So on the one hand, they've been trying to repress that decentralized market-conforming activity, while at the same time promoting this engagement that's controlled by the state. So when we try to strengthen the markets, I think it's a good thing, but I think it's a thing the North Korean government is going to be resistant to. Remittances are interesting. I'm actually also thinking about writing in fact, I did write a blog post about this. I wrote a blog post about this because there's a huge development economics literature on remittances, giant literature that shows the impact of remittances on receiving countries and economies in all sorts of conditions. And in general, remittances are associated with higher rates of education of families that receive the remittances because they're able to pay more for their children's education, or the children have to work less, educated more. Greater rates of business formation for obvious reasons. That's your working capital or seed money to get you started, and so on. So you can imagine a situation in North Korea where remittances could be play an important role in kind of fueling this nascent market economy, which in some ways it seems to in fact be doing. It's also interesting how remittances and those money flows are affecting the sorts of control issues that I alluded to in the presentation. Let me give you a very simple example based on anecdote. The plurality of refugees leaving North Korea come from North Hamgyong. That also happens to be arguably the most economically depressed part of the country because it's the Rust Belt. And so you have this combination of economically depressed region and close proximity to China with a relatively permeable border because of a small river. So you get lots of people coming out of North Hamgyong. Well, they send money back. And given the economically depressed nature of that economy, those remittances are playing an increasingly important role in the economy of North Hamgyong. Now, it used to be, and I think it probably still is, technically, if you make it to South Korea, you have committed treason. And in the old days, at least, your family was then incarcerated in the Gulag. But what we hear anecdotally now is that it doesn't, we have the normal kind of extortion. Mr. Norper, you have a very nice hauling business. It's a very attractive business. I think you and I ought to be partners. And, you know, Steve doesn't want to see himself or his family thrown into one of these labor training centers, so he starts paying me, right? Well, we have a thing with remittances now where it's, Mr. Norper, I know that your brother has made it to Seoul. And as long as you share, it's okay. So transaction costs of getting money from South Korea to North Korea have gone up because of increased policing and militarization of the border. But then the share of that money that's being raked off by local officials is gotten pretty large as well. That's basically the price you pay for getting the remittance and staying out of the gulag. Well, if you're the central authorities in Pyongyang, this would make you uncomfortable. To a certain extent, this kind of extortion and corruption is okay because it's a safety valve. It allows you not to pay your officials kind of a full living wage because they're predating off the local population. But at a certain point, that corruption, the parochial interest of those local officials start to affect the centrally determined political agenda. And if the political agenda is, you go to South Korea, you're a traitor, your family goes to the gulag, and your local officials are turning a blind eye because they're pocketing remittances, that means your control over your own apparatus is fraying. And what we've seen in North Korea is recurrently these kind of, you know, one of my colleagues called them Gestapo sort of groups that are sent into the border region to try to clean up the corruption, and they do it, but because the incentives for corruption are so strongly built in, it comes back. And so right now the North Koreans are going through another one of these things where they've actually now using military units to go in and try to wipe out the corruption in the border region, but unless you change the fundamental incentives, it will then build itself back up.
Hi, Sakil Park, also of Link. I'd also like to thank you for this research. I think it fills a really important gap in the literature. Maybe to follow on from some of the comments that you just made about the North Korea's government's resistance to top-down reform, I was wondering if you could speak to reform from below and specifically the potential for the attempts to regularize perhaps the stream of income from bribery, producing some kind of provincial level policy innovation, and maybe following on from that, the equilibrium between these different factors of marketization, corruption, reliance on the government and party as dominant forces in society, and also the top-down resistance and repression and purges, the kind of interplay between those factors producing some kind of equilibrium, but the potential for that to, you know, how that's going to change into the future. If you have any thoughts on that. I know that it's kind of an occupational hazard making any predictions on North Korea, but
well, actually, North Korea, so little is known that you can basically say anything and nobody can falsify what you say. So it's sort of akin to fiction writing,
okay,
frankly.
And then one last point, a smaller question. On the inhibitions on consuming foreign media, do you see that as a result of the hunger for foreign media going up, the appetite going up, or decreased perceptions of risk of consuming foreign media, or what are the factors driving the reduction of inhibitions? Thank you.
So I left my notebook in Steve's office, so I don't really have any paper to write down, jot notes about the questions and then what my answers are going to be, which is why my answers are sort of meandering a bit, and I left out the response on the media question that the Consul General asked. So, and I'm running out of, I have this very small piece of paper that I'm copying all this down on, so let me try. Okay, first of all, on the issue of reform from the bottom up. Haggard and I have also done a survey. I think it's a quite interesting survey of 300 Chinese entities doing business in the DPRK. And we've started writing this work up. We have one paper that's come out as a working paper. We have another one that will come out in the next month or two. very, very interesting. It is a business environment characterized by very low levels of trust, which we can measure in a variety of ways. We look at the financing terms and so on. It's basically all cash on the barrelhead. You got to pay dollars or you got to pay yuan. The Chinese want the deals to actually be transacted in China, all kinds of things. The Chinese regard the North Koreans as incredibly corrupt, and which is really striking because it's coming from Chinese. And it also, it sort of coincides with the reports we're getting from the refugees. I should have mentioned that we're getting from Chinese businessmen as well. And one of the hazards of the North Korean business environment is the lack of dispute resolution. I mean, there's always disputes in business, so how are you going to sort it out? There are no courts. I mean, there's formally a court, but I mean, there's, it's not a well-organized, sort of commercial, environment. And so what we find is that the Chinese do a lot to hedge themselves. They prefer to trade rather than invest because they fear expropriation. And when they aren't in North Korea, when they do have to expose themselves in some way, the way you resolve things is through personal political appeals. You got to know some local official. You got to know officials. And when we asked them about the officials, it was very interesting. Their responses paralleled my own experiences in another context, which was the local officials are the most likely to they're the most likely to be pragmatic and kind of work out a deal. And as you go up to the provincial level and then the national level and you get to Pyongyang, the officials become more rigid, more ideologically rigid, and less responsive. So it is conceivable to me that if they had enough autonomy, you could imagine situations in which local governments were trying to create more workable solutions to things, but they are likely to face opposition from the center, which again is trying to control. And what you end up in some of these situations is that basically your ability to operate is a function of your ability to kick money up to the center. So as long as you continue to kick money up to the center, you're given a certain degree of autonomy. As long as you continue to make your payments. It's kind of like the mafia, right? It's as long as these guys continue to make their payments up the chain of command, then there's a certain amount of just let them do what they're going to do. So one can imagine that sort of thing, but again, that goes against the interest of the instinct of the central government, which is a centralizing and controlling instinct. Foreign media. The consul asked me, what kind of media is it? One of the things that's happened over the last, 10 or 15 years is quite a proliferation of radio stations that are broadcasting into North Korea. You have radio stations that are basically South Korean, state-supported, South Korean, I would call them secular, South Korean Christian. You have Radio Free Asia, done by the United States, which is available in a much more limited way because they're broadcasting on shortwave and under not 24 hours a day. You even have Korean language service of Voice of America. So, and then you may have Japanese or Russian or Chinese or whatever. So there's lots of sources. It's mainly South Korean, and it's mainly radio. That is the mechanism. There is limited, some people in certain areas in North Korea can get South Korean television. There's obviously a big trade in South Korean DVDs. Much more limited in terms of print material. But the main media, the main news at least, channel seems to be radio, and with DVDs probably playing the most important role in terms of entertainment. Yeah. And whether it's demand and supply, I think it's demand. I think it's also, it's as again, these lowered inhibitions, I think there's a sense of you can just get away with it in a way that you couldn't 20 years ago. the degree of control. It's like the story I told you about, shaking down somebody's business or shaking down somebody from remittances. The degree of central control of the local policeman is eroding. And the central government understands this. And as I said, they periodically try to sort of reassert control. But as long as the incentives are as skewed as they are, people are going to behave like people.
Wonderful. Well, please help me in thanking Dr. Noland for a very comprehensive review. And he was very kind to come up on the Acela this morning. He's heading back this afternoon. So he's come just for this. For your train reading in the quiet car, we have something from one of our special literary events, My Korean Deli, which is a wonderful and humorous take. So do enjoy that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we would invite you, please, we still have some extra food at the back. We have this lovely exhibit at the back. In about 10 minutes' time, anyone interested in hearing about NGOs in North Korea will have a small informal session in our library here, and please do see our exhibition in the gallery. Aside from thanking Dr. Noland, I'd also like to thank Nikki Desai, our Assistant Director of Policy here, who has put this together, as well as Natalie Newcomb, our Program Associate, who does so much around as well. And to Peter in our sound booth and who does our audio, thank you. And thank you, Marcus. Have a great trip back. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you all.